The obsession, the world, the internet, everyone is waiting. They're hoping for this moment where you and Jennifer run into each other so they can take their picture.
I'll run into Jen. She's a good friend.
Brad Pitt, once hailed as the very embodiment of Hollywood royalty, became more than just a star. He became a myth, a face sculpted into the collective imagination of an entire generation. With chiseled perfection and effortless charm, he graced every red carpet as if he were born beneath spotlights. To the outside world, he was the man who had everything: global fame, devastating good looks, box office domination, and romances that captivated millions. But behind that glittering mask of invincibility was a man unraveling in silence. Beneath the suits tailored to perfection and the smile that could stop time, Brad Pitt harbored wounds that no camera could capture, a loneliness carved deep into the very soul of the man the world thought they knew. His name became synonymous with greatness, yet the deeper truth was rarely spoken. While fans obsessed over his public image, he quietly fought private battles with demons that fame only worsened. For decades, the myth of Brad Pitt stood untouched, polished by media adoration and studio legends. But as the years passed, the cracks in the facade grew harder to hide. Failed marriages, strained relationships with his children, and a haunting reliance on alcohol painted a vastly different portrait, one of a man searching for meaning, for healing, for something real. And now, at 61, as he stands in the twilight of his golden career, the illusion has begun to collapse. The story isn't one of failure. It's one of success so blinding that it masked unbearable grief. Because Brad Pitt didn't fall from grace in the way most do. He succeeded beyond imagination, only to discover that the summit he reached was cold, hollow, and filled with echoes of everything he had lost along the way. And what comes next in his story might just be the most heartbreaking part of all. Before he was the face on magazine covers or the heartthrob of a generation, Brad Pitt was just a boy from Missouri, quietly drowning in a world that demanded perfection and obedience. Born into a conservative Baptist household in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and raised in Springfield, Missouri, his early life was painted in quiet tones of discipline, duty, and emotional restraint. His father, a rigid trucking company owner, enforced an unspoken code of silence, while his mother, though warm, operated within boundaries that left little room for emotional vulnerability. From the outside, it looked like a textbook American upbringing, clean-cut, church-going, and respectable. But inside those walls, Brad was learning how to disappear behind a smile. By age 6, he was already gauging every word before speaking, already swallowing feelings that had no place in his tightly wound home. By 10, he had perfected the art of masking, charming, athletic, and effortlessly likable to his peers, yet internally burdened by guilt, confusion, and a growing sense of invisibility. He would later confess he felt shame growing up, not because of anything he had done, but because he never felt truly seen or heard. In church pews, he sat motionless, fearing that even curiosity might be mistaken for rebellion. At school, he ran faster and laughed louder, trying to prove he belonged. But alone in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, he questioned everything: his worth, his voice, his place in the world. The contradiction was unbearable: a golden child on the outside, a ghost on the inside. It was not trauma in the conventional sense, but a slow, relentless erosion of identity, masked so well that even he couldn't see how much damage was being done. He didn't grow up in chaos. He grew up in control, and that, in its own quiet way, was far more suffocating. This was the origin of Brad Pitt's tragedy, not in the spectacle of Hollywood, but in the quiet childhood moments where emotion was a liability, vulnerability was weakness, and the only way to survive was to pretend. By the time Brad Pitt reached his early 20s, the quiet suffocation of Springfield, Missouri had become unbearable. Though he had dutifully enrolled in the University of Missouri, majoring in journalism and advertising, every day spent in those sterile classrooms felt like another inch of his soul being buried beneath expectations he never chose. On paper, he was thriving, 2 credits away from graduation, popular, good-looking, and heading toward a stable career path. But deep inside, Brad was imploding. He didn't just want more. He needed more, something unspoken, something raw and unfiltered, a space where he could finally exhale without fear. That hunger, born in a house where feelings were silenced and perfected smiles were armor, became too powerful to ignore. And so in 1986, at just 23 years old, he made a reckless and almost desperate decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He dropped out of college without a degree, packed a few clothes, some cassette tapes, and a handful of dreams into a battered Datsun, and drove straight west toward Los Angeles with only $325 to his name. But this wasn't just a geographical move, it was an emotional jailbreak. He wasn't chasing fame yet, He was fleeing invisibility. To stay would have meant smiling forever for a life he didn't believe in, and Brad knew that if he didn't leave then, the boy who once wondered if anyone truly saw him might disappear for good. The road to LA wasn't romantic. It was laced with fear, with uncertainty, with the ache of severing himself from everything familiar. But it was also his first act of rebellion, a silent scream into the void that he wanted to be more than what Missouri had told him he could be. And though no one knew it then, not even Brad himself, this one act, this escape, wasn't just the start of a Hollywood story. It was the first step in a lifelong struggle to find himself beneath the layers of performance, perfection, and pain. When Brad Pitt arrived in Los Angeles, he didn't step onto red carpets. He stepped into humiliation. The city of dreams didn't roll out a welcome mat. Instead, it forced him to claw his way through anonymity, rejection, and jobs so degrading they would break a lesser spirit. With just a few $100s and no connections, Brad found himself roasting inside a giant chicken costume, waving desperately at traffic outside an El Pollo Loco fast food joint. The same man who would one day command $30 million per film was once paid to wear a beak and feathers under the sweltering California sun. Between shifts, he chauffeured strippers to bachelor parties, delivered refrigerators to strangers, and scraped by in an unforgiving city that only saw him as another good-looking extra in a sea of desperate faces. But what the world would later learn was that every moment of humiliation became fuel for a young man who had nothing left to lose. Every sweaty afternoon in that chicken suit became a silent act of defiance against a childhood that told him to sit still, smile wide, and stay invisible. He took the money from those jobs and poured it straight into acting classes, most notably with Roy London, one of the most revered acting coaches in the business. In those cramped studio rooms, Brad Pitt finally found something sacred: permission to feel. The boy who grew up being told to bury his emotions was now being asked to use them, to weaponize his vulnerability into art. It was a revelation that cracked him open. Acting wasn't just a career path. It was therapy, it was rebellion, it was survival. And while Hollywood still saw him as nothing more than a background prop in forgettable TV cameos like Dallas or 21 Jump Street, Brad was quietly sharpening a blade he would one day use to carve out a legend. These weren't just his early years, they were the fire in which he was forged. And while the world laughed at the guy in the chicken suit, Brad Pitt was already planning how to make them watch him in silence. In 1991, Brad Pitt's world changed forever, not with a lead role or a grand speech, but with a 14-minute scene that lit a cultural fuse. Cast as a charming drifter in Thelma and Louise, his sun-kissed abs and devil-may-care grin sent shockwaves through audiences and Hollywood. Practically overnight, he became a national obsession. Posters of him blanketed teenage bedrooms, casting him as the new golden boy of American cinema. But behind that breakout moment, behind the cowboy hat tipped just right and the shirtless confidence, was a man spiraling with uncertainty. The role that finally opened doors also slammed shut others, locking him into a gilded cage of image over substance. To the public, he was eye candy. To studios, he was a bankable smile. But to Brad, it was a cruel joke. He had escaped Missouri to find his voice, only to have it drowned out by flashbulbs and headlines screaming, "Sexiest man alive." He would later admit how uncomfortable he felt with the attention, how alien it was to be celebrated not for what he expressed, but for what he looked like. It was the cruelest irony. His beauty, the very thing that made him visible, also made him invisible in a different way. Directors saw the surface, not the storm inside. Producers wanted the poster, not the pain. And so Brad Pitt, who had sacrificed safety and endured humiliation for a shot at authenticity, found himself trapped again, this time not by a small-town childhood but by global expectations. He became a symbol but not yet an artist, and the question that had haunted him since boyhood, am I being seen for who I am or just what I project, only grew louder. As the world swooned, Brad stood in the middle of a media frenzy feeling hollow, already fearing that this newfound stardom might be a spotlight he could never escape. Because what if the only thing the world ever loved about him was the image they created, not the man behind it? In the years following Thelma and Louise, Brad Pitt clawed his way out of the pretty boy stereotype with a vengeance that was both artistic and deeply personal. He wasn't just trying to prove something to Hollywood, he was trying to prove something to himself. With each role, he tore further away from the image that had made him famous, chasing scripts that let him bleed, rage, and fracture on screen. A river runs through, it gave him his first taste of depth, but it was Legends of the Fall that transformed him into a mythic figure, a tragic hero cloaked in masculinity and sorrow. Then came Seven, a role that burned through the romantic sheen and exposed a darker edge. Audiences weren't just watching a handsome face anymore. They were watching a man unravel in real time, haunted by the same existential questions that chased him off the plains of Missouri. But it was Fight Club in 1999 that finally shattered the illusion for good. As Tyler Durden, Brad became the voice of a generation disillusioned by consumerism and emotional numbness. He didn't just act the part, he embodied it, channeling years of inner conflict into a performance that was both magnetic and manic. Yet even as critics applauded and audiences worshipped his raw transformation, the curse of duality remained. With each new role, Brad was gaining credibility but also losing something: peace, privacy, a sense of who he really was beyond the layers of persona. Interviews from that era reveal a man growing increasingly restless, uncomfortable in his own skin despite the success surrounding him. He was earning tens of millions per film, headlining blockbusters like Troy and redefining cinematic masculinity. But inside, he felt like a fraud, an actor not just playing characters but playing a version of himself that had never been real. The climb had been steep, but the view was isolating. Because while the world finally took him seriously, Brad Pitt still couldn't answer the question echoing through every performance. Was he truly being seen, or had he just learned how to disappear more convincingly? While Brad Pitt's career skyrocketed into Hollywood's upper stratosphere, behind closed doors he was unraveling in silence, gripped by a storm of self-doubt, emotional exhaustion, and addiction that no magazine cover could capture. On the outside, he was the man who had it all: blockbuster films, critical acclaim, and an empire of influence that stretched from red carpets to Oscar stages. But in the silence of his own home, he was spiraling. Brad later confessed in rare interviews that during the height of his fame, he was deeply uncomfortable in his own skin and constantly running from himself. Alcohol became a refuge, a numbing escape from the questions he couldn't answer and the pain he couldn't name. Nights blurred into each other, the clink of ice in a glass echoing louder than the applause of audiences. He didn't just drink socially. He drank to disappear, to quiet the inner voices that told him he wasn't enough, that the world loved only the mask, never the man. And as his fortune grew into the hundreds of millions and his roles became more demanding, the private man behind the myth began to fracture. The spotlight, once a source of validation, became a blinding prison, exposing him to everyone but shielding him from no one. He was haunted by the thought that he had become a hollow vessel, performing on screen while slowly decaying inside. Even his accolades felt meaningless, empty trophies that couldn't silence the war raging beneath the surface. He would later describe his years of drinking as a period of emotional numbness, a haze in which he was present in body but absent in spirit. Those close to him saw the signs, moments of withdrawal, the pain behind his smile, the slow erosion of joy. Brad Pitt wasn't living, he was surviving. And the most devastating part wasn't the addiction itself, but the way it mirrored his earliest lessons: to never show weakness, to hide pain, to pretend everything was fine. The boy from Missouri had grown into a global icon, but the emotional armor he built to survive his childhood had now become the very thing destroying him. And what came next would test every shred of his identity, not as a movie star, but as a man desperate to heal. Long before tabloids would feast on the wreckage, Brad Pitt believed he had found salvation in love. Not once, but twice, and both times it slipped through his fingers like dust. His relationship with Gwyneth Paltrow in the mid-1990s was more than just Hollywood glamour. It was, in his own words, the love of his life. Their chemistry was electric, their bond intense, and for a brief, shining moment, they seemed destined for forever. But Gwyneth, barely into her 20s, felt the weight of that spotlight crush her resolve. She ended the engagement, and Brad, who had risked his heart fully, was left hollowed by grief, struggling to understand how something so perfect could collapse so silently. The pain of that breakup was not just emotional, it was existential, confirming the fear that perhaps love, like fame, would never anchor him. Then came Jennifer Aniston, America's sweetheart, and for a time it looked as though the fairy tale had returned. Their wedding in Malibu was the stuff of legend: 50,000 flowers, a gospel choir, fireworks over the Pacific. Together they embodied Hollywood's golden couple, a vision of hope in an industry addicted to chaos. But behind the glittering facade, shadows were growing. Jennifer longed for children, for stability, for a quieter life beyond the red carpets. Brad, consumed by career momentum and internal unrest, drifted into emotional distance. Paparazzi followed their every move, headlines speculated with vicious glee, and public pressure turned private wounds into national spectacle. When the divorce came in 2005, it wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the shattering of an illusion. Jennifer became the face of heartbreak, Brad the villain in a story written by a million strangers. He didn't just lose a wife, he lost the love of a public that had once crowned him their hero. And in the years that followed, even as he admitted to personal failings and substance abuse, the sting remained. Brad had chased love as the cure for a lifelong ache, but instead, each heartbreak only deepened the silence he had tried so hard to escape. The fairy tale had crumbled, and in its place stood a man forced to confront the truth that even love in its most dazzling form could leave scars that never fully fade. In 2019, as Brad Pitt stood on the stage of the Dolby Theater clutching his long-awaited Oscar for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the world saw triumph, the kind of career-defining moment that cements a legend's legacy. He smiled, delivered a sharp, charming speech, and basked in the glow of an industry that had finally honored him with its highest prize. But when the cameras turned off and the tuxedo came off, the truth returned like a ghost in the dark. Because for Brad Pitt, the golden statue in his hand didn't silence the ache in his chest, nor did it erase the years of emotional damage, failed relationships, and lonely nights blurred by alcohol and regret. By then, his net worth had ballooned to over $400 million, his mansion walls adorned with fine art and prestigious awards, but what they couldn't provide was peace. Friends and insiders would later reveal that behind his public grace, Brad remained haunted by personal voids, estranged connections with some of his children, scars left from the implosion of his marriage to Angelina Jolie, and the heavy toll of a lifelong war with himself. The Oscar wasn't a moment of arrival, it was a mirror, reflecting back a life of contradictions. He had achieved everything the world said he needed to be whole, yet he felt more fractured than ever. Even as he produced films through his award-winning company Plan B, celebrated for tackling stories of human pain and resilience, Brad struggled to tell his own truth without trembling. He had become the architect of cinematic catharsis, yet couldn't fully access his own. In interviews following the Oscar win, he spoke with vulnerability rarely seen in actors of his stature, admitting to years of running from himself, hiding behind roles, hiding behind a drink, hiding behind charm. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all, that his most celebrated performance wasn't on screen, but in real life, where for decades he had played the role of the man who had it all, while inside he remained the same boy from Missouri, still searching for someone who could see past the mask. The Oscar glistened under the lights, but in Brad's eyes, it shimmered with quiet sorrow. Now at 61, Brad Pitt stands at a crossroads where time itself feels like both a gift and a punishment, the mirror of age reflecting not just lines etched across his once perfect face, but the battles that carved them there. He is wealthier than he ever dreamed, his legacy secured in Hollywood history, his name forever linked to some of cinema's most iconic roles. Yet beneath the applause, he carries the weight of a man still learning how to live with himself. The boy who grew up hiding behind smiles has become an elder statesman of film, but the masks never fully came off. They only shifted, from the golden boy of Thelma and Louise to the tortured soul of Fight Club to the quiet dignity of an Oscar-winning producer. What remains consistent is the tension between the man the world sees and the man he knows himself to be. He has spoken with brutal honesty in recent years about sobriety, about trying to rebuild fractured relationships with his children, about seeking something resembling peace after decades of chaos. And yet, the tragedy lingers in the unanswerable question: can a man who spent his entire life playing roles ever truly find his own identity when the cameras stop rolling? Friends describe him today as gentler, more introspective, but also haunted, as though every success reminds him of what it cost. He has houses filled with art, vineyards that produce world-class wine, and a career that filmmakers envy. But what he cannot buy is time lost to addiction, marriages that dissolved into bitterness, and the innocence of a youth sacrificed to the relentless gaze of fame. Brad Pitt at 61 is not just a story of triumph or tragedy. It is both, intertwined so tightly that one cannot be separated from the other. He is haunted by the boy in Missouri who wanted nothing more than to be seen, honest enough now to admit the wounds fame never healed, and human in a way that makes his story less about superstardom and more about survival. And perhaps that is his final role, not a character on screen, but a man stripped bare at last, confronting his life not as Hollywood's golden boy, but as Brad Pitt, fragile, flawed, and still searching for peace in the fading light.